Duke Cassian Blackthorn stood alone in the empty ballroom where he had destroyed everything that mattered. Crystal chandeliers hung above him like frozen stars, reflecting nothing but his own miscalculation. 2 years of brilliance had walked out the door without a single word of protest, and the silence she left behind was louder than any declaration of war. This is the story of a man who ruled empires but couldn't rule his own cowardice, and the woman who taught him that some battles can't be won through dominance. If you want to see how a king learns to kneel, stay until the end. Drop a comment with your city and let me know if you've ever watched someone leave without fighting back. Because that kind of silence hits different. Hit that like button if you believe real power isn't about conquest. The northern wind carried ice through Ravenspire like a living blade. It cut through wool and leather, sliced past stone walls, and reminded every soul in the territory that Duke Cassian Blackthorn's domain existed where warmth went to die. The castle rose from black cliffs like a monument to refusal, each tower a declaration that nature itself could be dominated through sheer architectural spite. Inside those walls, servants moved with the practiced silence of people who understood that visibility equaled vulnerability. Cassian sat in his private study, fingers steepled beneath his jaw, staring at military correspondence he couldn't focus on. The room smelled of leather-bound law books and the particular kind of wood smoke that came from forests too frozen to burn properly. Every object in this space had been positioned with deliberate precision. The desk faced the door at an angle that forced visitors to approach at a disadvantage. The chair behind it sat elevated exactly 3 inches higher than standard. The portrait of his grandfather loomed above the fireplace, eyes painted to follow movement across the room with predatory attention. Control had always been architecture to Cassian. You built environments where other people's choices narrowed to the ones you permitted. Footsteps approached from the corridor. Not the hesitant shuffle of a servant, but the confident rhythm of someone who had earned the right to enter without announcement. Lady Seraphina Vale opened the door and stepped inside with a leather portfolio under one arm and exhaustion barely visible beneath her composed expression. Her dark hair was pulled back in a style too practical for court and too elegant for labor. She wore deep emerald that season, a color that made her look like old money wrapped in quiet lethality. Most men saw beauty first when they looked at Seraphina. Cassian had learned years ago to see the mechanism beneath. The way her eyes cataloged everything in a room within 3 seconds. The slight tilt of her head when she identified a lie. The dangerous stillness that preceded her most devastating observations. She dropped the portfolio on his desk without ceremony. "I have the vote counts from the Southern Barons. It's worse than we thought." Cassian opened the portfolio, scanning numbers that confirmed what he'd suspected. His infrastructure reforms, the ones designed to modernize Ravenspire's mining operations and force the old aristocracy into the current century, were hemorrhaging support faster than he could intimidate it back. How much worse? Seraphina moved to the window, looking out over the iron forest that stretched toward the horizon like serrated teeth. "We're down 8 confirmed votes. 3 more are wavering. Your uncle's been working the private dinner circuit, Lord Mordrin Blackthorn." The name landed in Cassian's mind like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples of complication in every direction. His father's younger brother, a man who controlled enough banking connections and historical favors to strangle Cassian's political momentum whenever the mood struck him. Cassian stood, moving to the fireplace where light and shadow fought for dominance across his features. He was 34 but looked older in certain light, particularly around the eyes. Conquering territories aged you differently than building them. One required brief explosions of ruthless calculation. The other demanded sustained brutality against entropy itself. "What's his price this time?" Seraphina turned from the window, and for just a moment something flickered across her face too quickly to name. Alliance, marriage. "He wants you engaged to Lady Marguerite Ashton before the Crown Assembly convenes. The Ashton family. Coastal lords with shipping fleets and military contracts that dated back 3 generations. Politically valuable, strategically positioned, personally irrelevant. Cassian processed the information with the emotional investment of someone reviewing grain shipments. "And if I refuse?" Then he pulls his financial backing. The mining reforms collapse. Ravenspire's expansion stalls. We lose 5 years of positioning in a single parliamentary session. Seraphina delivered this assessment in the same tone she used for everything. Precise, clinical, stripped of personal investment. It was one of the qualities Cassian valued most about her. She never contaminated strategy with sentiment. "What do you think?" he asked. She met his gaze with those dark eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. "I think your uncle understands leverage better than anyone in this kingdom. I think Lady Marguerite is beautiful, pliable, and completely uninteresting. I think the marriage would secure votes you can't afford to lose." She paused, and in that pause lived every conversation they'd never had about what existed between them, in the space where strategy ended and something unnamed began. "I think you'll do what you always do. Calculate the cost. Pay it. Win." Cassian wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that some prices weren't worth paying regardless of political outcome, but the words died in his throat because she was right. This was who he'd always been, a man who conquered through calculation, who treated every human variable like a piece on a game board that existed solely to advance his position. He'd built an empire on that principle. Why would he stop now? "Set up a meeting with Lord Mordrin," Cassian said quietly. "Let's hear his terms directly." Serafina nodded once, picked up her portfolio, and walked toward the door. She moved with the efficiency of someone who'd just completed a transaction, nothing more. "Serafina." She stopped, hand on the doorframe, not turning around. "Your assessment was accurate, as always." It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't acknowledgement. It was the verbal equivalent of filing a report. She left without responding. The door closed with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence no one wanted to finish. The private breakfast chamber existed in the eastern wing where morning light hit first. It was the smallest room in Blackthorn Keep, barely larger than a servant's quarters, with windows that overlooked the ocean cliffs and a table built for two. No guards stood outside. No servants interrupted unless summoned. For 2 years, this space had functioned as the operational heart of Cassian's political empire, the place where strategy was born before it ever reached the public chambers. Serafina sat across from him 3 mornings after their conversation about Lord Mordrin, reviewing correspondence while eating toast with methodical precision. She'd developed a habit of reading documents at a 45-degree angle, positioning them to catch light while maintaining peripheral awareness of everything else in the room. Cassian had watched her do this hundreds of times, this small ritual of controlled multitasking that somehow made her more effective than men who dedicated full attention to single tasks. "The Northern Rail expansion is approved," she said without looking up. "Construction begins next month." Cassian poured coffee from the silver pot between them, black and strong enough to strip paint. "Projected completion? 18 months if weather cooperates, 2 years if it doesn't. Budget concerns? Already addressed. I reallocated funds from the coastal fortification project. We can delay that another season without strategic risk." She said this while spreading jam on toast, as if restructuring military budgets required the same attention as breakfast preparation. This was how they functioned. Seamless integration of thought and execution. 2 minds working in parallel toward outcomes neither needed to explain because understanding had become automatic. Cassian studied her across the table, this woman who had somehow become the gravitational center of everything he built. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense that court ladies cultivated. Her features were too sharp, too intense, assembled for intimidation rather than attraction. But there was something magnetic in the way she occupied space, a density of presence that made every other person in a room seem somehow diluted. "When did you stop sleeping?" he asked. She glanced up, momentarily confused by the deviation from professional script. "What? You have shadows under your eyes. You've had them for 3 weeks." Serafina set down her toast with careful precision, the kind of movement people made when they were deciding how much truth to deploy. "I sleep fine, liar." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Are you worried about my performance, Your Grace?" The formal title landed like a small blade between them. She used it when she wanted distance, when conversations drifted too close to territories they'd both agreed never to explore. Cassian leaned back in his chair, coffee cup balanced on his knee. "I'm observing that my strategist is exhausted and wondering if it's affecting operational efficiency. Your strategist is managing 14 simultaneous political campaigns across 6 territories while preventing your infrastructure reforms from collapsing under aristocratic sabotage. Exhaustion is structural, not circumstantial." Then delegate. "To whom?" She leaned forward slightly, and her voice took on an edge he recognized as suppressed frustration breaking through professional composure. You've built an empire that runs on centralized control. Every decision funnels through you, which means every piece of information funnels through me first. That's not a workload you delegate. That's an architecture of power you chose. She was right, and they both knew it. Cassian had constructed his political machine to eliminate weakness through consolidation. He trusted no one completely except the woman sitting across from him, which meant she carried the weight of an entire duchy's strategic planning on shoulders that were only human. The silence that followed stretched uncomfortable and unfamiliar. They rarely fought. Conflict required emotional investment beyond what their professional arrangement permitted. Serafina picked up her toast again, taking a bite with exaggerated calm. I'm fine, Cassian. Focus on your uncle's meeting tomorrow. That's the actual problem we need to solve. The meeting. Right. The conversation where Lord Mordrin would detail exactly what political salvation would cost. Cassian drained his coffee and stood. He moved to the window, looking out over cliffs where ocean met stone in endless violent repetition. Have you ever wanted something besides this? Besides what? This. He gestured vaguely at the room, the reports, the endless mechanical process of maintaining power. Strategy, conquest, empire management. Serafina was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quality he'd never heard before. Something almost vulnerable. I wanted to be necessary. I wanted to be so good at something that my value became undeniable. She paused. I achieved that. It didn't sound like victory. Cassian turned from the window to find her staring at nothing in particular, toast forgotten on her plate. And now? Now I'm exactly what I wanted to be. Indispensable, irreplaceable, trapped by my own competence. The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Before Cassian could respond, before he could ask what she meant by trapped, Serafina stood abruptly and gathered her papers with the brisk efficiency of someone fleeing a crime scene. I have meetings this afternoon. Correspondence from the capital needs responses by evening. I'll see you at dinner. She left before he could object. The breakfast chamber felt larger without her in it, colder, like something essential had been removed and all that remained was expensive furniture arranged around an absence. Tag. Lord Mordrin Blackthorn inhabited spaces the way conquerors inhabited territories, through aggressive displacement of everything that came before. He arrived at Blackthorn Keep with an entourage designed for maximum theatrical intimidation. Personal guards, financial advisors, and Lady Marguerite Ashton herself, displayed like a prize weapon in silk and strategic beauty. Cassian received them in the Grand Receiving Hall, a room built specifically to make visitors feel psychologically crushed by architectural superiority. Vaulted ceilings rose 40 feet overhead, where banners from 3 generations of conquest lined the walls. Portraits of dead Blackthorns stared down with expressions that suggested they'd died angry and intended to remain that way. Lord Mordrin walked the center aisle like he owned it. He was 63 but carried himself with the aggressive vitality of someone determined to outlive enemies through spite alone. His face bore the kind of hardness that came from decades of extracting value from human weakness. Nephew. His voice echoed off stone walls with practiced resonance. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting, as if Cassian had any choice. Uncle! Cassian remained seated on the ducal chair, a power position that forced Mordrin to approach from below. Lady Marguerite. Welcome to Ravenspire. Lady Marguerite Ashton was 26 and looked like someone had commissioned a portrait of ideal femininity, then brought it to life through expensive breeding and aggressive etiquette training. Blonde hair, blue eyes, a smile calibrated to appear genuine without requiring actual emotion behind it. She curtsied with mechanical grace. Your Grace, the honor is mine. Cassian studied her with the detached interest of someone examining livestock. Beautiful, certainly. Politically connected? Undoubtedly. Intellectually challenging? He doubted she'd ever challenged anything in her life. Lord Mordrin got straight to business, because pretending this was a social visit insulted everyone's intelligence. The Crown Assembly convenes in 6 weeks. Your infrastructure reforms need 8 additional votes to pass. I can deliver those votes through my banking connections and family alliances. He paused for effect. In exchange, you marry Lady Marguerite before the session begins. Cassian kept his expression neutral. That's quite a price. That's quite a crisis. Mordrin stepped closer, lowering his voice to the register of false intimacy. You've built something impressive here, Cassian, but empires don't run on ambition alone. They run on alliances. marriages, the structural bonds that survive individual personalities. He was right, and Cassian hated him for it. And if I refuse, then you watch 5 years of work collapse in a single parliamentary vote. Your reforms fail. Your political enemies smell blood. Ravenspire's expansion stalls while hungrier lords take territories you were too proud to secure properly. The threat wasn't subtle, but effective threats rarely were. Cassian looked past his uncle toward Lady Marguerite, who stood with perfect posture and an expression of pleasant neutrality. She was a prop in this negotiation, a beautiful variable being moved around a strategic equation. Lady Marguerite, do you have thoughts on this arrangement? She blinked, momentarily surprised to be addressed directly. I would be honored to serve House Blackthorn, Your Grace. My family's shipping interests align well with Ravenspire's expansion goals. I believe we could build something mutually beneficial. It was a speech she'd been coached to deliver, probably practiced in front of mirrors. Cassian felt something cold settle in his chest. This woman would be perfectly adequate. She'd smile during public events, host dinner parties with mechanical charm, produce heirs with appropriate genetic credentials. She'd be everything a duchess was supposed to be, except the one thing that mattered. She wouldn't be Serafina. The thought arrived unbidden and unwelcome, carrying implications Cassian had spent 2 years avoiding. He looked back at his uncle. I need time to consider. Lord Mordrin's expression hardened. You have 3 days. After that, I withdraw my support entirely, and you face the assembly alone. He turned and walked toward the exit, Lady Marguerite following like a well-trained shadow. When they were gone, Cassian sat alone in the receiving hall, surrounded by dead ancestors and expensive silence. He'd conquered territories through careful calculation of cost versus benefit. He'd destroyed rivals by identifying their weaknesses and exploiting them without hesitation. He'd built an empire by treating every decision as a mathematical problem with optimal solutions. But this equation had a variable that refused to be quantified. What was Serafina worth? What value could you assign to someone who'd become the operational center of everything you built? How did you calculate the cost of betraying the only person who'd ever made you feel like something more than a title and a territorial claim? Cassian sat in that hall for 3 hours, running scenarios in his mind. Every scenario ended the same way. He chose power. He always chose power. The winter banquet was an annual tradition designed to remind everyone in the Northern Territories exactly where political power resided. 200 aristocrats, military commanders, and wealthy merchants gathered in Blackthorn Keep's grand ballroom beneath chandeliers that cost more than most people earned in lifetimes. Orchestra music filled the space with cultured sound, while servants circulated with wine expensive enough to murder for. Cassian stood at the head table in formal military dress, every button and medal positioned for maximum visual authority. To his right sat Lord Mordrin, radiating smug satisfaction. To his left, an empty chair waited for Lady Marguerite Ashton, who was being introduced to various nobles by her ambitious mother. Serafina sat 4 positions down the table, technically honored placement but noticeably distanced from the ducal seat. She wore deep burgundy that made her look like controlled violence wrapped in expensive fabric. Her expression was perfectly neutral, the kind of neutrality that required tremendous effort to maintain. Cassian had told her about the engagement 2 days prior, alone in his study, delivering the information with the clinical precision of someone reporting weather conditions. She'd listened without interruption, asked 2 clarifying questions about political timeline, thanked him for informing her personally. Then she'd left. No protest, no tears, no dramatic declarations. Just professional acceptance of an outcome she'd probably calculated weeks before he had. The orchestra shifted to a formal processional. Conversations dimmed. Every eye in the room turned toward the main entrance where Lady Marguerite appeared in white and gold like a living declaration of dynasty continuation. She walked toward this head table with practiced grace, her smile bright enough to cause snow blindness. Cassian stood, playing his role in this theater of aristocratic inevitability. Lord Mordrin rose as well, preparing to make the official announcement. The room held its breath. Distinguished guests, Mordrin's voice carried across the ballroom with rehearsed authority. It is my profound honor to announce the engagement of Duke Cassian Blackthorn to Lady Marguerite Ashton. Their union will strengthen both our families and secure Ravenspire's continued prosperity for generations to come. Applause erupted like trained seals performing on command. Lady Marguerite reached the head table, extending her hand to Cassian with choreographed elegance. He took it, feeling nothing except expensive fabric and strategic obligation. But 20 aristocrats weren't watching the engaged couple. They were watching Serafina, waiting for the breakdown, the public humiliation, the emotional devastation of a woman displaced by prettier, younger, better connected competition. Cassian felt his jaw tighten. Part of him wanted her to react, to give him permission to acknowledge that this decision destroyed something real. Instead, Serafina lifted her wine glass with hands that didn't tremble. She gestured to a nearby servant. "More salt, please." Her voice was perfectly steady. The servant approached with a silver salt cellar, placing it within reach. Serafina thanked him with distant politeness, then returned to her meal as if nothing significant had occurred. Around the table, nobles exchanged glances loaded with confusion and reluctant respect. This wasn't how displaced women behaved. They wept, they fled, they caused scenes that would be gossiped about for months. Serafina did none of those things. She simply continued existing in a space that had just declared her irrelevant. The silence around her was louder than any scream. Cassian felt something crack inside his chest, a hairline fracture spreading through foundations he'd assumed were solid. He'd expected her to break. He'd been prepared for her devastation because it would confirm that this decision mattered, that their 2 years together had been more than professional convenience. But Serafina's composure was far more terrifying than any emotional collapse. It meant she'd already left. Not physically, not yet, but in every way that mattered, the woman who had stood beside him for 2 years had just proven she knew exactly how to walk away. Lady Marguerite leaned close, her perfume expensive and aggressive. "Your home is beautiful, Your Grace. I look forward to making it ours." Cassian nodded automatically, his attention still locked on Serafina 4 seats down. She was cutting her food with methodical precision, chewing with measured timing, drinking wine at appropriate intervals. Everything about her posture screamed control. Everything about her silence screamed goodbye. The orchestra began playing waltz music. Couples moved toward the dance floor and practiced formations. Lord Mordrin clapped Cassian on the shoulder. "You should dance with your fiancée. Give them something romantic to remember." Cassian stood, offering his hand to Lady Marguerite because the script demanded it. They moved to the center of the ballroom floor. Her hand felt light in his, insubstantial, like holding expensive air. She smiled up at him with eyes that sparkled with appropriate admiration. "I know this is arranged, Your Grace, but I promise to be everything you need." The words were meant to be reassuring. They felt like a prison sentence. Cassian guided her through the waltz with mechanical precision, his body executing steps his mind barely registered. Over Lady Marguerite's shoulder, he watched Serafina stand and quietly exit the ballroom through a side door. No drama, no final look back. Just silent departure. The woman who had helped him conquer territories and crush political enemies had just executed the most devastating strategic maneuver of her career. She'd made her absence more powerful than her presence had ever been. And Cassian, Duke of Ravenspire, conqueror of northern territories, master of political warfare, suddenly understood something that terrified him more than any battlefield. He'd just lost the only war that actually mattered. The music played on. Lady Marguerite continued smiling. Aristocrats continued dancing, and somewhere in the darkness beyond that ballroom, Serafina Vale was learning how to exist without him. The truly horrifying part was realizing she'd probably be better at it than he would. The morning after the banquet arrived with the kind of cold that felt personal. Cassian woke alone in ducal chambers that suddenly seemed designed for someone else, staring at ceiling frescoes depicting ancient blackthorn victories that now looked like expensive lies. He'd slept 3 hours, maybe 4, his mind cycling through the same sequence of images on endless repeat. Serafina's steady hand lifting that wine glass, the way she'd requested more salt like she was ordering ammunition, the absolute stillness of her posture as 200 aristocrats waited for her humiliation. She'd given them nothing, which meant she'd taken everything. He dressed without summoning servants, needing the mechanical simplicity of buttons and fabric to anchor him against thoughts that kept sliding toward territories he'd spent years avoiding. The engagement was strategically sound. Lord Mordrin's banking connections would secure the votes. The reforms would pass. Ravenspire's expansion would continue uninterrupted. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. So why did victory taste like ashes? Cassian made his way to the private breakfast chamber out of habit, muscle memory carrying him through corridors while his mind remained elsewhere. He pushed open the door, expecting emptiness, already knowing she wouldn't be there, but needing to confirm the absence anyway. The room was exactly as they'd left it 2 days prior. 2 chairs, 2 place settings. The silver salt cellar sitting at the center of the table like a small monument to everything he'd just destroyed. He sat in his usual position, poured coffee from a pot gone cold, and stared at the empty chair across from him. For 2 years, that chair had been occupied by the only person who'd ever made him feel like something more than a territorial claim with a pulse. She'd sat there every morning, reviewing correspondence while eating toast, her presence so constant he'd stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing air until suddenly you can't breathe. The door opened. Cassian's head snapped up with desperate velocity that embarrassed him. But it wasn't Serafina. A servant entered, young and clearly terrified of interrupting ducal solitude. "Your Grace, Lady Vale requests a formal meeting at your earliest convenience. She asked me to deliver this." The servant held out a sealed letter, cream-colored paper with Serafina's personal seal pressed into black wax. Cassian took it with hands that wanted to tremble and refused to permit weakness. "That will be all." The servant fled. Cassian broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Her handwriting was precise, controlled, every letter formed with the same methodical attention she applied to political strategy. "Your Grace, I am formally resigning my position as your strategic advisor, effective immediately. All active projects have been documented with transition notes for your review. I will collect my personal belongings from the East Wing chambers this afternoon between 2 and 4 o'clock to minimize disruption to regular castle operations. I have accepted a guest residence at Lady Verona Ashcomb's estate and will be relocating there within the week. Thank you for the opportunity to serve House Blackthorn. I wish you success with your upcoming marriage and the Crown Assembly vote. Respectfully, Serafina Vale." Cassian read it twice, searching for hidden meaning beneath professional courtesy and finding nothing except perfectly executed strategic withdrawal. She'd reduced 2 years to a resignation letter, stripped their partnership down to employer-employee formality, erased herself from his empire with the same efficiency she'd used to build it. The rational part of his mind recognized this as tactically brilliant. Clean break, minimal drama, zero leverage for enemies to exploit. She was protecting both their reputations by making her departure look voluntary and dignified rather than bitter displacement. But the part of him that had spent 2 years watching her dissect complex problems over breakfast toast wanted to put his fist through the wall. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against stone floor with a sound like a scream trapped in wood. She thought she could just leave, just walk away like their partnership had been some temporary arrangement that could be dissolved with a formal letter and logistical scheduling. Cassian had conquered territories through understanding how people thought, what motivated them, where their weaknesses lived. Serafina's weakness was her competence. She'd built her entire identity around being necessary, being the indispensable architect behind someone else's empire. Remove that foundation and what was left? He'd find out this afternoon. Between 2 and 4 o'clock, she'd said, Cassian would be waiting. The East Wing chambers had been Serafina's private workspace for 18 months, a converted library that she'd transformed into something between war room and sanctuary, lined with bookshelves holding legal texts, territorial maps, and correspondence files organized with color-coded precision that would make military generals weep with envy. Cassian arrived at 1:30, deliberately early, positioning himself in the leather chair by the window, where light would hit his face at an angle that made reading his expression difficult. Control was architecture. Even in surrender, you built the environment. She arrived at exactly 2 o'clock because punctuality was both weapon and armor to people who'd learned that reliability equaled value. Serafina stopped in the doorway when she saw him, surprise flickering across her features for maybe half a second before professional composure locked back into place. Your Grace, I wasn't expecting you. That's why I came early. She moved into the room with careful deliberation, setting down the leather case she'd brought for packing. She wore traveling clothes, practical and expensive, the kind of outfit designed for someone relocating to a different social orbit entirely. I can return later if you need the space. No. Cassian's voice came out harder than intended. We're going to talk. I believe my letter outlined everything necessary. Your letter outlined logistics. It didn't explain why you're running. Her eyes narrowed, and there it was, the flash of steel beneath diplomatic polish. I'm not running, Cassian. I'm leaving. There's a difference. Enlighten me. Running implies fear. Fear implies you still have power over me. She began pulling books from shelves, stacking them with controlled aggression. I'm simply reallocating my time toward situations where my skills are valued rather than convenient. The words landed like small explosions in the space between them. Cassian stood, moving closer but maintaining enough distance to avoid looking desperate. You think I don't value you? I think you value what I can do for you. She didn't look at him, focusing instead on books like they were the most important thing in the room. I think you value having someone who makes your empire run smoothly without requiring emotional investment. I think you value convenience. That's not fair. Fair? She turned on him then, and the fury in her eyes was controlled but absolute. You announced your engagement to another woman in front of 200 people. You didn't warn me privately first. You didn't ask how I felt. You treated me like a piece of furniture that could be rearranged without consultation. I told you 2 days before the banquet. You informed me. There's a difference. Information flows downward, Cassian. Consultation happens between equals. She went back to packing. You made it very clear which category I occupy. He wanted to argue, wanted to explain the political pressure, the impossible choice between her and everything he'd built. But the words died because she was right. He'd informed her the way generals inform soldiers about deployments, as if her feelings were secondary to operational necessity. What did you expect me to do? Cassian heard the edge in his own voice, frustration bleeding through calculated control. Refuse my uncle? Watch 5 years of work collapse? Sacrifice Ravenspire's future because you and I have some undefined relationship that we've both been too afraid to name? Serafina went very still. When she spoke, her voice was quiet in a way that made it more dangerous. I expected you to fight. The 3 words hung in the air like an indictment. I expected you to tell your uncle to go to hell. I expected you to value what we built together more than you valued political convenience. She finally looked at him, and her eyes were dry but devastating. I expected you to choose me, Cassian, just once, just one single time. I wanted to be the thing you couldn't sacrifice. The raw honesty in her voice cut deeper than any political maneuvering ever had. Cassian felt something fundamental shift inside his chest, foundations cracking under weight they were never designed to carry. You know what the worst part is? Serafina continued, her voice steady despite the emotion beneath it. I don't even blame you. This is who you've always been. A man who conquers through calculation, who treats people like strategic assets, who built an empire on the principle that nothing personal matters more than power. She picked up another stack of books, holding them against her chest like armor. I just finally realized I don't want to be a strategic asset anymore. I want to be chosen, not useful, not convenient, not indispensable, just chosen. Cassian opened his mouth but had no idea what words could possibly bridge the canyon opening between them. Before he could attempt speech, Serafina grabbed her leather case and walked toward the door. Wait. She paused, back to him, hand on the doorframe. Don't do this. Don't do what? Exactly. She didn't turn around. Don't leave? Don't protect myself? Don't demand more than whatever scraps of attention you throw my way between political campaigns? That's not what this is. Then what is it, Cassian? She finally turned, and the exhaustion on her face was so complete it physically hurt to witness. Tell me what we are. Define this thing we've been dancing around for 2 years. Give me one honest answer about what I actually mean to you beyond strategic utility. The question sat between them like a loaded weapon. Cassian had spent his entire life avoiding moments like this. Moments where emotional honesty created vulnerability that enemies could exploit. He'd built an empire on the principle that revealing what you actually cared about was the fastest way to hand opponents leverage. But standing in that converted library, watching Serafina prepare to walk out of his life forever, he finally understood something terrifying. The thing he cared about most was already walking away. You're everything, he said quietly. Serafina's expression didn't change. Everything except enough to fight for. She left. The door closed with the finality of a verdict being delivered. Cassian stood alone in the room, surrounded by empty bookshelves and the particular silence that follows when something irreplaceable is removed from a space. He'd conquered territories by understanding that every person had a price, a lever, a weakness that could be identified and exploited. He'd assumed Serafina's weakness was her need to be necessary. He'd been wrong. Her weakness had been hoping he'd prove himself worthy of what she offered, and he'd just failed that test spectacularly. Lady Verona Ashcomb's estate existed in the kind of old money elegance that made new wealth look desperate by comparison. Sprawling gardens, marble fountains, architecture that whispered rather than shouted. It was the domain of a woman who'd survived 3 husbands through superior strategy and now occupied her position in society like a queen who'd abdicated the throne but kept all the power. She was 72, sharp as broken glass, and ran exclusive salons where the kingdom's most formidable women gathered to discuss art, philosophy, and which lords needed destroying this season. Serafina had met her exactly once, at a charity gala 6 months prior. They'd spoken for 15 minutes about trade policy and infrastructure development. Lady Verona had invited her to visit any time. Serafina hadn't expected the invitation to be genuine, but 3 days after leaving Blackthorn Keep, she found herself in a guest suite that overlooked gardens where winter roses somehow survived northern cold through sheer aristocratic stubbornness. Lady Verona entered without knocking, carrying a tea service like she'd personally murdered the concept of boundaries and enjoyed every minute of it. "You look terrible, darling." She set the tea down and poured 2 cups with the casual precision of someone who'd weaponized hospitality. "When was the last time you slept?" "Tuesday, I think." "It's Friday." Serafina accepted the teacup because refusing would be rude, and Lady Verona was the kind of person who noticed rudeness the way hawks noticed field mice. The old woman settled into the opposite chair, studying Serafina with eyes that missed nothing. "I heard about the engagement announcement. Quite the spectacle from what my sources report. I'm sure it was very romantic." Lady Verona laughed, a sound like crystal shattering in controlled demolition. "Oh, darling, we both know romance had nothing to do with it. Lord Mordrin orchestrated a political transaction, and your Duke executed it with all the emotional investment of signing shipping manifests. He's not my Duke." "No?" Lady Verona sipped her tea with predatory elegance. "Then why do you look like someone carved your heart out with a dinner knife?" Serafina wanted to deflect, to deploy the professional armor that had protected her for years. But exhaustion had stripped away her ability to lie convincingly. "I thought I could be enough." She heard her own voice crack slightly and hated the weakness. "I thought if I made myself indispensable, if I proved my value through competence and strategic brilliance, eventually he'd see me as more than just useful." Lady Verona set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Let me tell you something I learned after burying 3 husbands, darling. Men who view relationships as strategic transactions will always sacrifice people for power. It's not cruelty, it's structure. They literally cannot compute the equation differently. So I was stupid to hope. You were human to hope. There's a difference." Lady Verona leaned forward slightly. "But now you have a choice. You can return to him when the guilt gets uncomfortable and he tries to renegotiate terms. Or you can actually leave. Not physically. Anyone can walk away from a building. I mean, leave the identity you built around being necessary to him." Serafina felt tears threatening and forced them back through pure spite. "I don't know how to be anything else." "Then learn." Lady Verona stood, moving to the window. "I'm hosting a salon next week. 12 brilliant women discussing art and philosophy and occasionally destroying reputations for sport. You should attend. I'm not really social. Neither am I, which is why I only surround myself with people worth talking to." She turned from the window. "You spent 2 years making a duke's empire function. Imagine what you could build for yourself if you stopped treating your competence like currency you needed to trade for affection." The words landed like a physical blow. Serafina had spent so long being valuable to someone else that she'd forgotten value could exist independently. She'd made herself indispensable to Cassian's empire without ever asking what she wanted to build for her own sake. "I wouldn't know where to start." Lady Verona smiled, and it was the expression of someone who'd spent decades watching powerful men make predictable mistakes. "Start by having tea next Tuesday with women who don't need you to be anything except interesting. We'll work from there." She left Serafina alone with tea and thoughts that felt dangerously close to hope. The Crown Assembly convened in the capital with all the theatrical pageantry aristocracy could manufacture when pretending democracy existed. 500 lords, barons, and territorial representatives gathered in a chamber built specifically to make individual voices feel insignificant against collective authority. Cassian sat in the Ravenspire delegation section, Lord Mordrin to his right, trying to focus on voting procedures while his mind kept sliding toward the empty chair that should have held his strategic advisor. Lady Marguerite sat in the family observation gallery, beautiful and appropriately enthusiastic, waving at him during breaks like they were starring in a romantic play someone else had written. The infrastructure reforms came up for vote on day 3. Lord Mordred's banking connections delivered exactly as promised. 8 additional votes materialized from territories that had been hostile 2 weeks prior. The reforms passed with a comfortable margin. Cassian watched the final count get announced and felt absolutely nothing. Victory was supposed to feel different than this. After the session adjourned, nobles approached to offer congratulations. They praised his political maneuvering, complimented his choice of bride, suggested future collaborations now that Ravenspire's expansion was secured. Cassian smiled and nodded and executed his role with mechanical precision while his mind screamed at the hollowness of it all. That evening, Lord Mordred hosted a celebration dinner at his capital estate. 50 guests, expensive wine, speeches about the Blackthorn dynasty's bright future. Cassian stood when protocol demanded, raised his glass when toasts were offered, and moved through conversations like an actor who'd forgotten why the script mattered. Lady Marguerite appeared at his elbow during dessert, slipping her hand through his arm with practiced affection. "You seem distracted, Your Grace. Just tired." She smiled understandingly. "It's been an exhausting week, but we won. Your reforms passed. Everything you worked for is secure." "Right? Everything I worked for. Except the person who'd actually done most of that work wasn't there to witness the victory she'd engineered." Cassian excused himself from the dinner early, claiming fatigue. He returned to his temporary quarters in the capital and found a letter waiting on his desk. Not from Seraphina. From his head of household at Blackthorn Keep. "Your Grace, Lady Vale collected the last of her personal belongings this afternoon and has officially vacated the East Wing chambers. All transition documentation has been filed in your private study. Her forwarding address is listed as Lady Verona Ashcombe's estate. Several staff members have requested clarification on how strategic operations will proceed without Lady Vale's oversight. Awaiting your instruction." Cassian read the letter 3 times, each word driving home the reality he'd been avoiding. She was actually gone. Not temporarily relocated, not strategically positioned elsewhere. Gone. He moved to the window overlooking the capital's night skyline, lights spreading across the city like stars that had fallen and gotten trapped in architecture. Somewhere in this kingdom, Seraphina was learning to exist without him, and he was learning that winning every battle meant nothing if you destroyed the only war that mattered in the process. What? 2 weeks after the assembly vote, Cassian returned to Ravenspire to find his empire functioning exactly as designed. Servants maintained schedules, advisors filed reports, correspondence flowed through proper channels. Everything worked. Nothing felt right. He sat in the private breakfast chamber out of masochistic habit, staring at the empty chair across from him while trying to process reports that suddenly seemed unbearably tedious without Seraphina's analysis to make them comprehensible. His new chief strategist, a competent man named Gregory with excellent credentials and zero personality, delivered updates with efficient boredom. "The mining expansion is proceeding on schedule. Your Grace, the Northern Rail contracts have been finalized. The coastal fortification project is ready to resume funding allocation." All projects Seraphina had initiated and structured. Gregory was maintaining systems she'd built, following blueprints she'd drawn, executing strategies she'd designed. He was adequate, which made his adequacy feel like an insult to everything she'd been. That afternoon, Cassian did something he'd successfully avoided for 2 weeks. He opened the transition documentation Seraphina had left in his study. 17 leather-bound folders, each containing detailed notes on active projects, political relationships that needed maintenance, upcoming decisions that would require careful navigation. She documented everything with the thorough precision of someone who knew exactly how catastrophic her absence could be and had chosen to prevent that catastrophe anyway. Even in leaving, she'd protected him. Cassian picked up the first folder and found a handwritten note clipped to the front page. "Cassian, by the time you read this, I'll be settled at Lady Verona's estate and you'll be preparing for your wedding to Lady Marguerite. I want you to know that I don't hate you. I understand the position you were in. I even understand the choice you made. But understanding and accepting are different things. You taught me how to build empires, how to read political currents, how to turn someone else's vision into operational reality. Those are valuable skills, and I'm grateful for them. What you couldn't teach me was how to value myself beyond my usefulness to someone else. I'm going to learn that now. I hope your marriage brings you everything you need. I hope the reforms succeed. I hope Ravenspire becomes everything you envisioned. And I hope someday you learn that the greatest empire you could have built was the one where you chose love over legacy. But that's not who you are. And I finally understand that's not something I can fix. Goodbye, Cassian. S. He read it until the words blurred. Then he read it again. She'd reduced their entire relationship to a learning experience. A chapter in her development that had reached its natural conclusion. She'd forgiven him, which somehow felt worse than hatred, because forgiveness implied she'd moved past needing anything from him at all. Cassian sat alone in his study, surrounded by documentation of everything they'd built together, finally understanding what he'd actually lost. Not a strategic advisor, not a useful asset, the only person who'd ever looked at the monster he'd become and chosen to stay anyway. And he'd traded her for parliamentary votes and his uncle's banking connections. Lady Verona's salon met on Tuesday evenings in a drawing room that smelled of old books and expensive wine. 12 women ranging from 25 to 70, every one of them formidable in ways that made conventional power structures nervous. Serafina had attended 3 sessions and was beginning to understand why Lady Verona's invitations were considered both honor and strategic opportunity. These women didn't need to prove anything. They'd already conquered their respective domains through intelligence, survival, and the particular kind of ruthlessness that looked like grace from a distance. Tonight's topic was art patronage and cultural influence. One woman ran the kingdom's largest publishing house. Another controlled shipping routes that made or destroyed merchant fortunes. A third advised the crown on economic policy while pretending to be decorative. They spoke in layers. Surface conversation about paintings and sculptures, subtext about power dynamics and political maneuvering. Serafina mostly listened, still learning the language of spaces where competence didn't need to be constantly demonstrated. During a break, Lady Verona materialized at her elbow with wine and predatory interest. "You're being quiet. I'm observing." "You've been observing for 3 weeks. Eventually you'll need to participate." She handed Serafina a glass. "Unless you're planning to stay invisible forever." "I spent 2 years being visible. I'm enjoying the alternative." Lady Verona studied her with those hawk eyes. "You're hiding. There's a difference between choosing privacy and using invisibility as armor. Maybe I like armor." "Of course you do. It kept you safe while standing beside a man who treated affection like a strategic weakness. But you're not standing beside him anymore." She sipped her wine. "So the question becomes, who are you when you're not defined by someone else's empire?" Serafina didn't have an answer. She'd spent so long being Cassian's strategic architect that she'd forgotten how to exist independently. Her entire identity had been built around being necessary to his vision, valuable to his goals, indispensable to his success. Remove that framework, and what remained? A woman who was brilliant at executing other people's plans, but had no idea what her own plans looked like. The realization was both devastating and somehow liberating. "I don't know who I am without him," Serafina admitted quietly. Lady Verona smiled. "Good. That's where interesting things begin." She gestured toward the other women in the salon. "Baroness Thorne controls publishing. Lady Blackwood runs shipping networks. Duchess Markham shapes economic policy. Every one of them started by being useful to someone else. Husbands, fathers, brothers." She paused for effect. "And every one of them eventually learned that the skills you develop serving someone else's empire are exactly the skills you need to build your own." Serafina felt something shift in her chest. Not hope, exactly. More like the first structural calculation of what might be possible. "I wouldn't know where to start." "Start with what you're good at." Lady Verona's eyes gleamed. "You understand political infrastructure better than most lords twice your age. You see patterns others miss. You know how to turn vision into operational reality?" She leaned closer. "The question isn't whether you have valuable skills, darling. The question is what you want to build with them now that you're not building someone else's legacy." Serafina looked around the room at 12 women who'd each carved power from systems designed to exclude them. They hadn't done it by being useful. They'd done it by being undeniable. "What if I fail?" Lady Verona laughed. "Then you'll fail spectacularly, and we'll all be entertained. But my guess is you're too competent for spectacular failure. You'll probably just build something remarkable and make a lot of men very uncomfortable in the process. She clinked her glass against Serafina's. Welcome to the part of your life where you matter for your own sake. The wedding was scheduled for late spring when weather would cooperate with outdoor ceremonies and aristocratic theater. Lord Mordred had already begun organizing guest lists and political seating arrangements that would maximize alliance visibility. Lady Marguerite threw herself into planning with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed love could be manufactured through proper decoration and expensive flowers. Cassian attended planning sessions with the emotional investment of someone scheduling infrastructure maintenance. 3 weeks before the ceremony, he received an unexpected letter, not from Serafina, from Lady Verona Ashcombe. Duke Blackthorn, I am writing to inform you that Lady Serafina Vale has accepted a consulting position with my informal advisory council. She will be assisting several members of my social circle with political strategy and infrastructure development. I thought you should know that the woman you treated as disposable is currently being courted by 3 duchesses, 2 merchant guilds, and a coalition of northern lords who recognize brilliance when they see it. She sends her regards. Actually, she didn't, but I thought mentioning it would irritate you more. Lady Verona Ashcombe Cassian read the letter twice, fury and something uncomfortably close to pride warring in his chest. She was building her own empire, using skills she'd developed beside him to create power structures that didn't require his participation or permission. Part of him wanted to congratulate her. Part of him wanted to burn down Lady Verona's estate. The rational part of his mind recognized this as exactly what should happen. Serafina was brilliant, capable, and no longer wasting those qualities on someone who'd proven he valued power more than partnership. But the part of him that woke up every morning staring at an empty breakfast chair wanted to ride to Lady Verona's estate and demand Serafina explain how she could just move on like their 2 years. Together had been some temporary apprenticeship. He did neither. Instead, he threw himself into wedding preparations with aggressive focus, determined to prove that his decision had been correct. The marriage would secure alliances. Ravenspire would continue expanding. Political influence would grow. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. So why did success feel like slow-motion catastrophe? The night before his wedding, Cassian couldn't sleep. He stood in the empty ballroom where he'd announced his engagement to Lady Marguerite 3 months prior, staring at the spot where Serafina had sat with that devastating composure while 200 aristocrats waited for her destruction. She'd given them nothing. She'd proven that walking away with dignity was more powerful than any theatrical breakdown. And he'd let her go because fighting for her would have required courage he didn't possess. Footsteps echoed across marble floor. Cassian turned to find Lord Mordred approaching, carrying brandy and satisfaction like twin weapons. Couldn't sleep either? His uncle poured 2 glasses without asking permission. Tomorrow's a significant day. Cassian accepted the glass mechanically. Is it? You're securing Ravenspire's future, strengthening alliances, continuing the Blackthorn legacy. Mordred raised his glass. Your father would be proud, would he? Lord Mordred studied him with calculating eyes. You seem troubled, nephew. I'm fine. You're thinking about the Vale woman. It wasn't a question. Cassian didn't answer, which was answer enough. Lord Mordred sipped his brandy with theatrical patience. She was useful. I'll grant you that. But usefulness isn't dynasty material. Lady Marguerite brings territorial advantages, military connections, breeding suitable for heirs. Serafina brought strategic brilliance, which you can hire. Mordred's voice hardened. What you cannot hire is political alliance forged through marriage. The Vale woman understood her limitations. That's why she left quietly instead of causing problems. She left because I chose power over her. You chose survival. Mordred set down his glass with deliberate force. Sentiment is a luxury lords cannot afford. Your grandfather understood that. Your father understood that. And you understand it, which is why tomorrow you'll marry Lady Marguerite and secure everything we've built. He moved toward the exit, then paused. The Vale woman will find another powerful man to serve. Women like her always do. They're competent, ambitious, and fundamentally incomplete without someone else's vision to execute. He left Cassian alone in the ballroom with brandy and the crushing weight of his own choices. Lord Mordred was wrong. Serafina wasn't incomplete without someone else's vision. She was building her own. And Cassian had just realized that watching her succeed independently was going to destroy him more thoroughly than her presence ever had. Because possession disguised as love had been comfortable. But losing the right to stand beside her felt like excavation of everything essential. Tomorrow, he would marry Lady Marguerite. Tomorrow, his political empire would be secured. Tomorrow, he would wake up knowing that the greatest victory of his life had been surrendered because he'd been too afraid to fight the only battle that actually mattered. The ballroom felt colder than winter. Cassian stood alone beneath crystal chandeliers that had witnessed his cowardice, finally understanding what Serafina had meant about being chosen. She hadn't wanted to be useful. She'd wanted to be worth fighting for. And he'd proven that nothing was worth more to him than the empire he'd built on everyone else's surrender. The brandy tasted like ash. The silence tasted worse. And somewhere in the darkness beyond these walls, the woman he'd lost was learning to laugh again, without him. That realization was the point of no return. Not the wedding. Not the political consequences. The moment he understood that Serafina would be fine without him. Better, even. While he would spend the rest of his life ruling an empire that felt like an expensive graveyard. Cassian didn't sleep that night. He stood at the window of his chambers watching dawn break over Ravenspire like an execution scheduled in pink and gold. In 6 hours, he would marry Lady Marguerite Ashton in front of 300 witnesses. In 6 hours, his political empire would be secured through bloodline and alliance. In 6 hours, he would cement the choice he'd made when he valued power over the only person who'd ever made power feel like it meant something. The morning felt like walking toward a cliff with clear vision and deliberate steps. A servant knocked at 4:30 with breakfast Cassian couldn't eat and correspondence he couldn't focus on. Among the letters was a small envelope with no return address, sealed with black wax that bore no family crest. Cassian broke the seal with fingers that wanted to tremble and found a single sentence written in handwriting he didn't recognize. If you want the truth about Lord Mordrin, come to the North Tower Library. Alone. Now. No signature, no explanation, just an invitation that felt like a trap and a lifeline simultaneously. Cassian should have ignored it, should have called guards, investigated the sender, approached with tactical caution. Instead, he dressed quickly and moved through empty corridors toward the North Tower, like a man who'd finally reached the point where catastrophe felt preferable to certainty. The library occupied the highest room in Blackthorn Keep, a circular space lined with books dating back 6 generations. Morning light filtered through narrow windows, casting shadows that moved like living things across ancient texts and forgotten genealogies. A figure stood by the far window, silhouetted against dawn. Not Serafina. Not any aristocrat Cassian recognized. A man in servant's clothes, maybe 40, with the kind of face that had learned to become invisible through practiced insignificance. Your Grace. The man's voice was steady despite obvious fear. Thank you for coming. Who are you? Marcus Threll. I've worked in Lord Mordrin's household for 15 years. I handle his private correspondence. Cassian's hand moved instinctively toward the knife he carried beneath his coat. If this is an assassination attempt, you've made a tactical error. If I wanted you dead, you'd already be dead. Marcus pulled a leather portfolio from inside his coat. I came to show you what your uncle has been building while you focused on reforms and weddings. He set the portfolio on the reading table between them. Cassian approached with predatory caution. What's in there? Proof that Lord Mordrin has been systematically destroying your political alliances for the past 6 months. Proof that he manufactured the crisis that forced you into this marriage. Proof that he's been positioning himself to control Ravenspire's financial infrastructure, regardless of whether your reforms succeed. The words landed like physical blows. Cassian opened the portfolio and found correspondence between Lord Mordrin and various lords, bankers, military commanders. The dates ranged from 8 months prior to 3 weeks ago. The content was meticulous documentation of orchestrated sabotage, letters to southern barons encouraging them to withdraw support for Cassian's reforms, financial agreements promising better terms if they voted against infrastructure expansion, military contracts contingent on opposing the mining modernization. Every political obstacle Cassian had faced in the past year had been manufactured by his own blood. Lord Mordrin hadn't been solving a crisis. He'd been creating one, then offering himself as the solution at a price that secured his control over the next generation of Blackthorn power. Cassian felt something fundamental crack inside his chest. Why are you showing me this? Because Lady Serafina Vale deserves better than watching you destroy yourself for a man who's been manipulating you since before you inherited the title. Marcus's voice carried unexpected steel. "I served 3 generations of Blackthorns. I watched your father build an empire on honor. I watched your uncle twist that empire into a weapon aimed at anyone who threatened his influence." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Lord Mordrin told me last week that Lady Seraphina was useful decoration you were smart enough to discard when real opportunity arrived. He laughed about it, said you'd finally learned that sentiment was weakness." The words hit harder than any battlefield wound. Marcus opened the door and looked back one final time. "Your wedding starts in 5 hours, Your Grace. You can marry Lady Marguerite and spend the rest of your life building an empire on lies. Or you can finally be dangerous enough to fight the only battle that matters." He left. Cassian stood alone in the library, surrounded by evidence of betrayal so complete it rewrote his entire understanding of the past year. Every crisis had been manufactured. Every political obstacle had been deliberate. Every moment of pressure that forced him toward sacrificing Seraphina had been orchestrated by the man he'd trusted most. Lord Mordrin had weaponized Cassian's own ambition against him, and Cassian had fallen for it with the predictable stupidity of someone who believed family loyalty ran deeper than strategic manipulation. He picked up the portfolio with hands that shook from fury rather than fear. Then he walked out of that library like a man who'd just learned the difference between ruling and surviving. Walk. Lord Mordrin's private chambers occupied the west wing, where morning light hit last, keeping rooms in shadow longer than architecturally necessary. The old lord preferred darkness, claimed it helped him think. Cassian suspected it just made lying easier when people couldn't see your face clearly. He didn't knock. The door slammed open with enough force to crack the frame. Lord Mordrin looked up from breakfast correspondence with surprise that shifted to calculated concern when he saw Cassian's expression. "Nephew, you should be preparing for the ceremony." Cassian threw the leather portfolio onto the table hard enough to send teacups skittering. "Instead, I'm reading letters that explain exactly how you manufactured every political crisis I've faced in the past year." Lord Mordrin's face went very still in a way that confirmed guilt more thoroughly than any confession. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't." Cassian's voice came out cold enough to freeze blood. "Don't insult both of us by pretending confusion. You sabotaged my reforms. You turned allies against me. You created the exact crisis that forced me into this marriage so you could control Ravenspire's financial future through Lady Marguerite's family connections." Lord Mordrin set down his teacup with careful precision. "Whoever gave you that information is trying to divide this family." Marcus Threll, your private secretary for 15 years. The man who handled every piece of correspondence in that portfolio. The name landed like an indictment. Lord Mordrin's expression shifted from denial to something colder. "Marcus is a disgruntled employee looking for severance leverage. Marcus is a man who spent 15 years watching you manipulate 3 generations of Blackthorns and finally decided someone should know the truth." Cassian moved closer, every step deliberate. "You destroyed my relationship with the only person who ever gave a damn about me. You forced me to choose between her and an empire you were actively sabotaging. You made me sacrifice everything that mattered so you could maintain control." Lord Mordrin stood and his voice took on the hard edge of someone who'd spent decades crushing opposition. "You sacrificed a competent strategist for political survival. That's what leaders do. They calculate cost and pay it. She wasn't a cost. She was the only honest thing in my life." "Honest?" Lord Mordrin laughed, and it sounded like breaking glass. "She was ambitious, useful, playing a longer game than you realized. The Veil woman understood exactly what she was doing, positioning herself as indispensable, so you'd eventually have no choice but to—" Cassian's fist connected with his uncle's jaw before conscious thought caught up to instinct. Lord Mordrin stumbled backward, blood appearing at the corner of his mouth. He touched it with trembling fingers, staring at Cassian with genuine shock. "You hit me. I should kill you." The words came out quiet and absolute. Lord Mordrin straightened, and something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "Everything I did was for this family, for Ravenspire, for the legacy your father built. You did it for control." Cassian felt decades of manipulation crystallizing into perfect clarity. "You couldn't stand that I was building something independent of your influence. So you manufactured crisis after crisis until I had no choice but to come begging for your help." He picked up the portfolio. "And when I finally sacrificed the woman I loved to secure your political support, you laughed about it. called her useful decoration, praised me for learning that sentiment was weakness. Lord Mordrin wiped blood from his mouth. Love is weakness when it interferes with dynasty. No. Cassian's voice was steel wrapped in ice. Cowardice is weakness. Betraying family is weakness. Building empires on lies is weakness. He moved toward the door. The wedding is canceled. The engagement is dissolved, and you are banished from Ravenspire effective immediately. You have 24 hours to vacate any property bearing the Blackthorn name. Lord Mordrin's face went pale. You can't do this. I'm the Duke of Ravenspire. I can do whatever the hell I want. Without my banking connections, your empire collapses. Without the Ashton alliance, your reforms die in Parliament. Without my support, you'll be destroyed by every enemy you've made in the past 5 years. Cassian reached the door and looked back at the man who'd shaped his entire approach to power through systematic manipulation. Then I'll rule ruins. But at least they'll be built on truth. He left his uncle bleeding in shadowed chambers, finally understanding what Seraphina had meant about fighting. Real battles weren't won through calculation. They were won by being willing to lose everything except your soul. Canceling a wedding 4 hours before ceremony was the kind of catastrophe that sent shockwaves through aristocratic society, like earthquake through crystal. Cassian stood in the grand receiving hall and made the announcement to 300 guests who'd traveled from across the kingdom, expecting romantic spectacle. The engagement to Lady Marguerite Ashton is dissolved effective immediately. I apologize for any inconvenience this causes. You are welcome to enjoy the prepared feast before departing. Silence fell like a physical weight. Lady Marguerite's mother fainted. Her father turned purple with rage. Lord Mordrin stood at the back of the hall with an expression that promised vengeance. But Cassian was done caring about aristocratic opinion. He'd spent his entire life building power through their approval, through calculated alliances and strategic marriages, and the systematic suppression of anything resembling authentic emotion. And it had cost him the only thing that made power feel like something besides expensive loneliness. Lady Marguerite herself approached with surprising composure. Her eyes were dry, her posture perfect, her voice steady. May I ask why, Your Grace? Because marrying you would be the final surrender in a war I didn't realize I was losing. Cassian met her gaze with honesty that probably hurt them both. You deserve someone who chooses you, not someone using you as a shield against his own cowardice. She studied him for a long moment. You're in love with her. The woman who left. Yes. Then go get her. Lady Marguerite turned and walked away with dignity. Cassian didn't deserve, leaving him alone in a ballroom full of scandalized aristocrats and the smoking ruins of everything he'd spent years building. His head of household approached with barely controlled panic. Your Grace, Lord Mordrin is rallying allies. He's calling emergency meetings with bankers and military contractors. He's threatening to withdraw all financial support and collapse Ravenspire's credit. Let him. But Your Grace, I said, let him. Cassian's voice carried across the hall with absolute authority. Announce that any lord who sides with Lord Mordrin in this matter will be considered an enemy of House Blackthorn. I'd rather rule a smaller empire built on loyalty than a larger one built on his manipulation. He walked through the stunned crowd toward the exit and sent a message to Lady Verona Ashcombe's estate. Tell her I need to speak with Lady Seraphina Vale. Today. Now. Immediately. The head of household nodded and fled. Cassian stood in the doorway looking back at 300 aristocrats who would spend the next decade gossiping about the Duke who canceled his wedding and destroyed his political future for a woman who'd already walked away. Let them talk. He'd spent his entire life being the kind of powerful they respected. Maybe it was time to be the kind of dangerous they feared. The ride to Lady Verona's estate took 3 hours through country roads still frozen from winter that refused to fully surrender. Cassian rode alone because guards would have implied he expected resistance, and he was done with strategic positioning. This wasn't politics. This was the only honest thing he'd attempted in years. The estate appeared through iron gates like something from a painting where beauty existed specifically to make violence look prettier. Marble fountains, winter gardens, architecture that whispered old money and older power. Cassian was met at the entrance by Lady Verona herself, 72 years of predatory elegance wrapped in silk and satisfaction. Duke Blackthorn. She looked him over like he was a specimen in a particularly entertaining study. I heard you canceled your wedding 4 hours before ceremony. The gossip networks are working overtime. I need to see Serafina. She's in the East Garden. Lady Verona gestured vaguely toward French doors that opened onto frozen paradise. But Duke Blackthorn, yes? If you hurt her again, I will dedicate the remainder of my considerable resources to destroying everything you've built. And unlike your uncle, I'll succeed. Noted. Cassian walked through corridors lined with art worth more than most territories, past rooms where brilliant women gathered to discuss philosophy and occasionally ruin reputations, toward gardens where winter roses somehow survived through aristocratic stubbornness. Serafina stood beside a frozen fountain, reading correspondence with the focused intensity he remembered from 1,000 mornings across breakfast tables. She wore deep blue that made her look like controlled ocean, hair loose in a way she never allowed during their strategic partnership, completely absorbed in whatever document required her attention. Cassian stopped 10 feet away, suddenly uncertain how to proceed. All his life he'd conquered through calculated approach, strategic positioning, careful manipulation of environmental advantages. But standing in a frozen garden, watching the woman he'd destroyed everything to reach, calculation felt like cowardice. Serafina looked up. Her expression cycled through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been hope before professional composure locked back into place. Your Grace? Her voice was steady. Shouldn't you be getting married right now? I canceled it. The words hung in cold air between them. Serafina set down her correspondence with careful precision. Why? Because my uncle spent the past year manufacturing every political crisis I faced. Because he sabotaged my reforms so he could force me into a marriage that would let him control Ravenspire's future. Because I built an empire on lies and the only honest thing in my life walked away when I proved I wasn't worth fighting for. He moved closer. Because I finally learned that some battles can't be won through calculation. They require being willing to lose everything except the one thing that actually matters. Serafina's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. And what matters, Cassian? You. Always you. From the first morning you sat across from me dissecting political strategy while eating toast. From every late night solving problems I couldn't solve alone. From 2 years of partnership that felt like the only real thing in a world built on performance. His voice cracked slightly. I love you. I've loved you since before I had language for what that meant. And I was too afraid to fight for you, because fighting would have required admitting that you mattered more than power. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough to see the exact moment her composure started fracturing. But I'm done being afraid. I'm done calculating cost. I'm done treating the best thing in my life like a strategic liability. Serafina's hands were shaking. You destroyed everything. Your political alliances, your uncle's support, your reforms. I destroyed an empire built on lies. Cassian's voice was steady now. I'd rather rule ruins with you beside me than inherit kingdoms without you in them. The garden was so quiet he could hear ice cracking on fountain stone. Serafina touched her face, and her fingers came away wet. You're an idiot, probably. You threw away everything you spent 5 years building. Yes. For me. For us. For the chance to build something that isn't contaminated by cowardice. She was crying now, really crying, tears running down her face in ways that made her look more beautiful than any controlled composure ever had. What if I say no? What if I tell you I've moved on and built my own empire and don't need you anymore? Then I'll respect that. Cassian felt his own eyes burning. And I'll spend the rest of my life knowing I waited too long to become the man who deserved you. He took one step closer. But I'm asking anyway. Not because you're useful. Not because you make my empire function. Not because you're strategically valuable. He met her gaze with everything he'd spent years hiding. I'm asking because you're the only person who ever looked at the monster I became and chose to stay. Because your laugh is the best sound I've ever heard. Because breakfast without you feels like expensive loneliness. Because I finally understand that the greatest empire I could build is one where I choose you every single day. Serafina was trembling. Her composure was gone. Her professional armor was shattered. Everything that made her look invulnerable had been stripped away until all that remained was raw honesty. Then ask me properly, she whispered. The words were an echo from a conversation months ago, a lifetime ago. Back when he'd first understood what choosing her would cost. Cassian had conquered territories without kneeling, But standing in that frozen garden with the only person who mattered, he finally understood that some victories required surrender. He dropped to his knees on frozen stone. Marry me. Not because it's strategic, not because it strengthens alliances, because I can't imagine spending another day pretending an empire means anything without you in it. Serafina looked down at him. This man who'd ruled through dominance, now kneeling in gardens like a supplicant before the only throne that mattered. Yes, she said quietly, but only if you promise to keep fighting. For us, against whatever comes, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Cassian stood and pulled her close, feeling her shake against him like something fundamental had finally clicked into place. I promise. His voice was rough. I'll fight the whole damn kingdom if that's what it takes. Good, because Lord Mordrin isn't going to accept this quietly. Let him try. Cassian pulled back enough to see her face. I'd rather face him honestly than hide behind alliances built on his manipulation. Serafina touched his face with trembling fingers. You're going to lose everything. I already lost everything when you walked away. This is just getting it back. They stood in that garden while winter roses bloomed around them in defiance of every reasonable expectation. Two people who'd spent years hiding behind strategy, finally brave enough to admit that love was the only war worth fighting. Lady Verona appeared on the terrace above, wineglass in hand. About damn time, she called down. I was beginning to think men in this kingdom were constitutionally incapable of basic intelligence. Cassian looked up at the woman who'd harbored Serafina while he figured out how to become worthy of her. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Lady Verona's smile was predatory. Your uncle is already mobilizing half the northern aristocracy against you. Banking networks are closing. Military contracts are being withdrawn. By tomorrow morning, you'll be facing the kind of political warfare that destroys dynasties. She raised her glass. But at least you'll be facing it with someone who actually gives a damn about you. That's more than most lords can say. She went back inside. Serafina looked at Cassian with eyes that held both love and ruthless practicality. She's right. We need to move fast. Lord Mordrin has had 15 years to build leverage. We have whatever time it takes him to weaponize it. Then we'd better get started. They walked back toward the estate together, fingers intertwined, already shifting into the strategic partnership that had always been their foundation, except now it was built on something stronger than professional convenience. It was built on the terrifying choice to value each other more than survival, and that choice would either save them or destroy them completely. But at least this time they'd face destruction together. The war began before they reached Blackthorn Keep. Cassian and Serafina rode through frozen country roads with two guards who'd chosen loyalty over Lord Mordrin's bribes, approaching the castle as dusk painted the sky in shades of violence. Smoke rose from the eastern battlements in signals Cassian recognized from military campaigns. His uncle was already moving pieces across the board, activating networks built over decades, while Cassian had been focused on reforms and empire expansion. The first messenger intercepted them a mile from the gates. A young rider, barely 16, trembling from cold and fear. Your Grace, the boy's voice cracked. Lord Mordrin has barricaded himself in the West Wing with 40 armed guards. He's claiming you've been compromised by outside influence and are unfit to rule. He sent riders to every major house in the northern territories demanding emergency counsel. Cassian felt Serafina tense beside him, but her voice stayed level. How many houses responded? 12 have pledged support to Lord Mordrin. 8 are still deliberating. The rest are waiting to see who survives the next 48 hours. The calculation was brutal and immediate. 12 houses meant military support, banking connections, and enough aristocratic legitimacy to challenge Cassian's authority in the Crown Assembly. His uncle had spent 15 years building exactly this kind of leverage, knowing that someday the investment would pay catastrophic dividends. Cassian had spent those same years believing family loyalty ran deeper than strategic positioning. He'd been catastrophically wrong. Tell our remaining allies to fortify their positions, Cassian said quietly. Anyone who sides with Lord Mordrin will be considered an enemy of House Blackthorn. No negotiations, no mercy. The messenger nodded and rode back toward the castle. Serafina looked at Cassian with eyes that held both love and ruthless assessment. He's going to burn everything you built. Yes. And you're going to let him? No. Cassian's voice was steel wrapped in ice. I'm going to rebuild on foundations that aren't contaminated by his manipulation. But first we have to survive whatever he's planned for tonight. They reached the castle gates to find them sealed from inside. Torches lined the battlements where guards stood, watching with the nervous energy of men who'd been ordered to choose sides in a conflict that would define their futures. Cassian dismounted and walked to the gate alone. "I am Duke Cassian Blackthorn, and this is my ancestral seat. Open these gates or be declared traitors to House Blackthorn." A voice called down from the battlements, not Lord Mordred's. One of his loyal commanders, a man named Graves, who'd served the family for 30 years. "Lord Mordred says you abandoned your duty, canceled a strategic marriage, brought shame to the Blackthorn name. He's claiming regency until you can be evaluated for mental fitness." The accusation was politically brilliant and personally devastating. Lord Mordred wasn't challenging Cassian's authority through direct combat. He was undermining it through bureaucratic procedure, making it look like concerned family intervention rather than naked power grab. It was exactly the kind of manipulation Cassian had been trained to execute, and now it was being used to destroy him. Seraphina moved to stand beside Cassian, her presence a declaration of alliance that would be noted by every witness. "Tell Lord Mordred that if he wants regency, he can come down here and take it." Cassian's voice carried across stone walls with absolute authority. "Otherwise, open these gates and let your rightful duke enter his own damn castle." Silence stretched like a blade against skin. Then Graves called down again, and his voice held genuine regret. "I'm sorry, Your Grace, but Lord Mordred controls the treasury keys and the military contracts. Until this matter is resolved, the gates remain sealed." Cassian felt rage, and something uncomfortably close to despair warring in his chest. His uncle had prepared for this confrontation with the thoroughness of someone who'd spent years anticipating every possible resistance. All Cassian had was the woman beside him, and the desperate conviction that some battles were worth fighting even when you knew you'd lose everything. "Then we do this the hard way," Cassian said quietly. He turned to Seraphina. "I need you to ride to Lady Verona's estate. Gather every ally she's connected to. Bring them back with whatever force they can muster." Seraphina's expression hardened. "I'm not leaving you. You have to. We need support, and we need it fast. Lord Mordred is counting on me being isolated. Prove him wrong." "What are you going to do?" "What I should have done years ago." Cassian looked back at the sealed gates. "Fight for what matters, instead of calculating the cost." Seraphina grabbed his face and kissed him hard enough to hurt. "Don't die before I get back." No promises. She mounted her horse and rode into gathering darkness, taking with her the only certainty Cassian had left. Then he turned back to his ancestral castle and prepared to siege his own home. The assault began at midnight. Cassian had gathered 18 loyal guards, 3 minor lords who'd chosen his side over Lord Mordred's, and a burning conviction that cowardice was more dangerous than any tactical disadvantage. They approached the east wall where defenses were oldest, built 3 generations prior when siege warfare followed different rules. Cassian had studied these fortifications since childhood, memorizing every weakness the way some children memorized prayers. Now that knowledge would either save him or get everyone killed. The first wave hit the wall with ladders and grappling hooks while archers provided covering fire. Guards on the battlements responded with crossbow bolts that struck stone and flesh with equal efficiency. Men screamed, metal rang against metal. Blood painted frozen ground in patterns that would haunt survivors for years. Cassian climbed beside his soldiers because leading from safety was the kind of calculated distance that had cost him Seraphina once already. His hands burned from rope. His shoulders screamed from exertion. Every breath tasted like smoke and copper. This was what it meant to fight for something that mattered. Not clean strategic maneuvering from comfortable war rooms, but brutal physical commitment that risked everything, including the body you needed to survive. He reached the top of the wall and came face to face with a guard he'd known for 8 years. A man named Petrov, who'd served loyally through 3 military campaigns. Their eyes met. Petrov hesitated. Then he stepped aside and let Cassian pass. "Your Grace," he said quietly, "Lord Mordred promised gold, but gold doesn't buy back honor." Other guards noticed, saw their companion choose loyalty over bribery. The psychological weight of that choice rippled through defenders like cracks spreading through ice. 3 more guards lowered their weapons, then 5, then a dozen. Lord Mordred's carefully constructed defense began fracturing as men who'd served House Blackthorn for generations remembered that some things mattered more than whoever controlled the treasury. Cassian stood on his own battlement, surrounded by soldiers who'd just chosen faith over certainty, looking out over castle grounds that had witnessed 3 centuries of Blackthorn rule. "Open the gates," he ordered. The massive iron barriers swung inward with sounds like mountains grinding together. Cassian walked through his ancestral entrance, flanked by guards who'd just committed treason against his uncle's authority, heading toward the West Wing, where Lord Mordrin waited with whatever final strategy he'd prepared for this moment. The castle felt different now, colder, like betrayal had seeped into stone itself and contaminated everything it touched. Cassian had conquered territories through understanding that power flowed from control. That dominance required systematic elimination of alternatives until people had no choice except obedience. But walking through corridors toward confrontation with the man who'd shaped his entire understanding of strength, he finally grasped what Serafina had tried to tell him months ago. Real power didn't come from controlling outcomes. It came from being willing to face catastrophic loss for something that mattered more than survival. Months. The West Wing was barricaded behind furniture and armed resistance. 40 guards loyal to Lord Mordrin formed defensive positions in corridors too narrow for numerical advantage. They'd fortified choke points with the professional efficiency of men who'd been planning this defense for weeks. Cassian stopped 50 feet from the first barricade. "Lord Mordrin." His voice echoed off stone walls. "You have one chance to surrender peacefully. Come out and face accountability, or I'll drag you out." Laughter floated from behind barricades. His uncle's voice, familiar and venomous. "You think you've won because some guards chose sentiment over strategy? I've been building this network for 15 years, nephew. I have banking connections that can strangle Ravenspire's credit. Military contracts that can turn your allies against you. Political leverage with houses you haven't even identified yet." Lord Mordrin stepped into view behind the barricade, flanked by armed guards. "You canceled a strategic marriage for a woman who made you feel special. You threw away everything I built for emotional comfort." He smiled without warmth. "You're not dangerous, Cassian. You're weak, just like your father was weak before he died, begging me to protect the family legacy." The words hit like physical blows, each one designed to cut through defenses and strike psychological vulnerabilities. But Cassian had spent months learning that vulnerability wasn't the same as weakness. "You're right," he said quietly. "I'm not the man you trained me to be. I'm not calculating enough, not ruthless enough, not willing to sacrifice people for political advantage." He walked forward until he stood 10 feet from the barricade. "But I am dangerous enough to burn this entire empire down rather than rule it on your terms. I'm dangerous enough to fight you with everything I have, even knowing I'll probably lose. I'm dangerous enough to value one honest relationship more than 1,000 strategic alliances." Lord Mordrin's smile faltered. "You taught me that power comes from control, that dominance requires systematic elimination of alternatives, that sentiment is weakness and calculation is strength." Cassian's voice was steady despite the fury beneath it. "But you forgot something crucial. Men who have nothing left to lose are the most dangerous opponents you'll ever face. And you just took everything from me except the one thing that actually matters. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to surrender. You're going to face trial for systematic sabotage of House Blackthorn. You're going to answer for 15 years of manipulation. Or I'm going to tear down every fortification between us and drag you out myself." Lord Mordrin's expression shifted from smug confidence to genuine uncertainty. "You'd destroy your own castle? Kill guards who've served this family for generations? I'll do whatever it takes." Cassian felt the truth of those words settle into his bones. "Because you taught me wrong. Power doesn't come from controlling people. It comes from being willing to sacrifice everything except your soul." He drew his sword. "Last chance, uncle." The West Wing erupted into violence. Guards rushed the barricades. Metal shrieked against metal. Men fought and died in corridors where Blackthorn generations had lived and loved and built empires on questionable foundations. Cassian fought at the front, his sword becoming an extension of will rather than tool of conquest. He'd been trained in combat by masters who understood that warfare was psychology expressed through controlled violence. Every strike was designed to create openings. Every defense anticipated 3 moves ahead. But fighting through his own home to reach the man who'd poisoned everything he built required something beyond technical skill. It required the terrifying clarity that comes from knowing you're fighting for the only thing that can't be replaced. He cut through 3 guards and reached the inner barricade where Lord Mordrin waited with his personal security, men who'd been paid enough to die protecting him. Cassian was bleeding from a dozen minor cuts. His breathing came ragged and painful. His muscles screamed from exertion that pushed past any reasonable limit. But he kept moving forward because stopping meant surrender, and surrender meant proving his uncle right. They met in the center of a hallway lined with portraits of dead blackthorns, ancestors who'd built this empire through conquest and ruthlessness, and the systematic suppression of anything resembling authentic emotion. Lord Mordrin held a sword he barely knew how to use, relying on guards to do violence while he orchestrated from safety. But his guards were falling, and Cassian was still standing. "You've lost, nephew," Lord Mordrin's voice carried desperate certainty. "Even if you kill me, the damage is done. 12 houses have turned against you. Banking networks are closed. Military contracts are dissolved. You'll spend the next decade rebuilding what I destroyed in 6 months. Probably." Cassian advanced slowly. "But I'll rebuild honestly, with people who actually matter, starting with the woman who's worth more than every political alliance you ever manufactured." He raised his sword. "This is for 2 years of manipulation, for forcing me to choose between her and an empire built on lies, for laughing when I sacrificed everything that mattered because you convinced me power required it." Lord Mordrin stepped backward, guards closing ranks around him. "Kill him, and you prove you're exactly the monster I created." The words were designed to paralyze, to inject doubt at the critical moment when certainty meant survival. But Cassian had learned something in Frozen Gardens while kneeling before the only throne that mattered. Some monsters were worth becoming if the alternative was cowardice. He moved. 3 strikes disabled the nearest guards. 2 more created opening toward Lord Mordrin. The old man stumbled backward, eyes wide with genuine fear, finally understanding that the weapon he'd sharpened for years was about to cut him. Cassian's sword stopped 1 inch from his uncle's throat. The hallway went silent except for ragged breathing and distant sounds of combat fading as remaining guards realized their employer was finished. Lord Mordrin stared at the blade with trembling rage. "Do it. Prove you're no better than me. I'm not trying to be better." Cassian's voice was exhausted and absolute. "I'm trying to be honest." He lowered the sword. "You're under arrest for systematic sabotage of House Blackthorn. You'll face trial before a council of neutral lords. Whatever they decide is your sentence." Lord Mordrin laughed, bitter and broken. "You think letting me live makes you honorable? It makes you weak. I'll spend every remaining day destroying whatever you build. Probably." Cassian gestured, and guards moved forward to restrain his uncle. "But you'll do it from exile, far from Ravenspire, far from any Blackthorn holding, far from the family you spent 15 years poisoning." He turned away from the man who'd shaped his entire understanding of power, feeling something fundamental shift in his chest. This was what it meant to fight for something real. Not clean victory where everyone acknowledged your dominance, but messy survival where you paid catastrophic prices and kept fighting anyway. Lord Mordrin was dragged away, screaming threats that would never materialize, leaving Cassian standing in corridors stained with blood from men who'd died, choosing between competing definitions of loyalty. The cost would be calculated later. Right now he needed to secure the castle and wait for Seraphina to return with whatever allies she'd managed to gather. Because Lord Mordrin had been right about one thing. 12 houses had turned against Cassian. Banking networks were closed. Military contracts were dissolved. The empire he'd spent 5 years building was collapsing in real time. All he had left was the desperate hope that honesty was worth more than every calculated alliance he'd destroyed. Dawn came with reports that felt like systematic execution of everything Cassian had built. 3 more houses had pledged support to Lord Mordrin's faction despite his arrest. Banking networks across the northern territories had frozen Ravenspire's credit. Military contractors were canceling agreements and demanding early payment on existing obligations. Cassian sat in his study reviewing financial documents that detailed exactly how thoroughly his uncle had positioned him for catastrophic failure. Every alliance had been structured with exit clauses. Every contract included contingencies that activated the moment Lord Mordrin withdrew support. It was masterful strategic sabotage, the kind of long-term planning Cassian himself would have admired if it wasn't destroying everything he owned. His new chief strategist, Gregory, entered with more devastating news. "Your Grace, we've received formal challenge from the Crown Assembly. Lord Mordrin's allies are demanding emergency session to review your fitness for ducal authority." "When?" 3 weeks. "They're citing erratic behavior, canceled strategic marriage, and violent assault on family member as evidence of mental instability. The accusation was politically lethal because it contained enough truth to sound credible. Cassian had canceled his wedding 4 hours before ceremony, had physically attacked his uncle, had thrown away carefully constructed alliances for emotional reasoning. Any objective observer would question his judgment. What do we have for defense? Evidence of Lord Mordred's systematic sabotage. Testimony from Marcus Threll about manufactured crises. Financial records showing manipulation. Gregory hesitated. But they're claiming you only discovered this evidence after falling under Lady Seraphina's influence. They're arguing she manipulated you into destroying relationships with legitimate allies so she could control you through emotional dependence. The accusation was vicious and strategically brilliant. It reframed Seraphina from victim to villain, made Cassian's choice look like weakness rather than courage, and gave the Crown Assembly exactly the narrative they needed to justify removing him. Lord Mordred might be arrested, but his network was executing his final strategy with ruthless precision. How long do we have before financial collapse? 6 weeks, maybe 8. Without access to banking networks, we can't pay obligations. Without military contracts, we can't maintain security. Without political allies, we can't prevent seizure of secondary holdings. The empire was dying, and Cassian had killed it by choosing love over calculated survival. He should have felt regret, should have questioned the decision that destroyed everything he'd built. Instead, he felt terrifying clarity. Some prices were worth paying if the alternative was becoming the kind of person who valued power more than humanity. Where's Lady Seraphina? Still gathering allies. Last report had her at the Ashcombe estate with Lady Verona. Send word that I need her here. Now. We're going to make one final stand. Gregory nodded and left. Cassian stood alone in the study, surrounded by evidence of catastrophic failure, staring at financial documents that detailed systematic destruction of everything he'd spent years building. His uncle had been right. Sentiment was weakness when it interfered with dynasty. Choosing love over political advantage was strategic suicide. Building empires required sacrificing people who made you feel human. Lord Mordred had taught him those lessons with the patience of someone who believed truth could be transmitted through repetition. But standing in ruins of everything he'd destroyed to become worthy of one honest relationship, Cassian finally understood what his uncle had gotten wrong. Weakness wasn't choosing love over power. Weakness was being too afraid to make that choice at all. The door opened. Seraphina entered like controlled fury wrapped in travel-stained clothes, followed by Lady Verona and 20 women who represented the most formidable informal power network in the kingdom. "You look terrible," Seraphina said. "I feel worse." "How many allies?" "Fewer than we need, more than you deserve." She moved to the desk, scanning financial documents with practiced efficiency. "This is catastrophic." "Yes. We're going to lose everything, probably. And you're still glad you fought?" Cassian looked at the woman who'd walked away when he'd proven himself unworthy, who'd rebuilt her life without him, who'd returned anyway when he'd finally been dangerous enough to choose her. "Every day for the rest of my life," he said quietly. Seraphina kissed him hard enough to forget they were surrounded by witnesses and impending financial collapse. "Then let's figure out how to survive this." She turned to Lady Verona and the assembled women who'd just committed their considerable resources to a fight they'd probably lose. "We have 3 weeks before the Crown Assembly session. 3 weeks to prove Cassian made the right choice. 3 weeks to build something stronger than Lord Mordred's manipulation." She looked around the room at faces that held intelligence, ruthlessness, and the particular kind of determination that came from watching powerful men make predictable mistakes. "I won't lie to you, we're probably going to fail. The political forces aligned against us are overwhelming. The financial damage is catastrophic. The best we can hope for is controlled collapse that doesn't destroy everyone associated with us." Lady Verona smiled. "Darling, I've survived 3 husbands and 40 years of aristocratic warfare. Controlled collapse sounds delightful." The other women nodded, their expressions ranging from predatory excitement to grim determination. Cassian watched Seraphina transform his private study into operational war room, directing women who'd each conquered their respective domains through intelligence and survival instinct. This was what he'd been too blind to see 2 years ago. Power didn't come from domination. It came from surrounding yourself with people dangerous enough to fight beside you instead of underneath you. The final battle was coming. The Crown Assembly would convene in 3 weeks, and Cassian would stand before lords and aristocrats who'd spent years obeying him through fear, asking them to believe that choosing love over calculated advantage was strength rather than weakness. He'd probably lose, but he'd lose honestly, with the woman he loved beside him, building something real from the ruins of everything he'd destroyed. Serafina looked up from strategic planning, caught his eye across the room, and smiled with the fierce joy of someone who'd finally found a battle worth fighting. The empire was collapsing. The future was uncertain. Everything he'd built was burning, and somehow standing in that study, surrounded by allies who'd chosen faith over certainty, Cassian felt more powerful than he'd ever felt ruling through dominance. Because real strength wasn't controlling outcomes. It was being willing to face catastrophic loss for something that mattered more than survival. The war was just beginning, and this time he was finally dangerous enough to fight it properly. The 3 weeks before the Crown Assembly session passed like watching an empire bleed out in slow motion. Every morning brought new reports of financial collapse, political abandonment, and systematic dismantling of everything Cassian had built. Houses that had sworn loyalty for generations found convenient reasons to withdraw support. Banking networks that had financed Ravenspire's expansion suddenly discovered irregularities requiring immediate debt settlement. Military contractors canceled agreements and sent invoices for termination fees calculated to maximize damage. Lord Mordrin's network was executing his final strategy with the ruthless efficiency of a machine designed specifically for this destruction, and the machine didn't care that its architect sat in exile awaiting trial. Cassian stood in his study reviewing financial projections that detailed exactly how many weeks remained before total collapse. 6, maybe 7 if they liquidated secondary holdings and dismissed half the household staff. The numbers were brutal mathematics of consequence, each digit representing choices that destroyed lives while preserving core survival. This was what it meant to pay the price for choosing love over calculated advantage. Not romantic sacrifice that felt noble in the moment, but grinding daily acknowledgement that every person who depended on your empire now suffered because you'd valued one relationship more than their collective security. The weight of that responsibility should have crushed him. Instead, it felt like the first honest thing he'd carried in years. Serafina entered without knocking, carrying correspondence and exhaustion she refused to acknowledge. She'd spent 3 weeks building alternative power structures, reaching out to women who operated in spaces Lord Mordrin's network couldn't access, constructing support from sources that didn't appear on traditional political maps. "We have commitments from 8 houses," she said, setting papers on his desk. "Not the 12 we lost, but enough to prevent complete isolation. Lady Verona's coalition has agreed to provide interim financial backing. Duchess Markham is willing to testify about Lord Mordrin's manipulation tactics. It's not enough." "No." Serafina met his gaze with ruthless honesty. "It's not. We're still going to lose most of what you built, but we might survive the collapse." Might was the operative word. Survival wasn't guaranteed. It was a possibility they were fighting toward through daily acknowledgement of how thoroughly they'd been outmaneuvered by someone who'd spent 15 years preparing for exactly this confrontation. Cassian moved to the window overlooking frozen grounds where winter finally seemed willing to surrender to spring. Ice was melting on stone walls, revealing damage that had been hidden beneath beautiful devastation. The castle needed repairs they couldn't afford. The territories needed infrastructure investments that would never materialize. The people who'd built their lives around Ravenspire's stability faced futures defined by his choice to value personal authenticity over collective security. Some days he wondered if Lord Mordrin had been right all along. That sentiment was weakness when it interfered with dynasty. That love was luxury lords couldn't afford. That choosing one person over an empire was the kind of selfishness that destroyed everyone who depended on you. But then Serafina would appear beside him, her hand finding his without needing invitation, and he'd remember why some battles were worth fighting even when you knew the cost would be catastrophic. Because empires built on lies eventually collapsed anyway. At least this collapse was honest. "Tell me we're doing the right thing," he said quietly. Serafina was silent for a long moment. Then she squeezed his hand with fingers that had learned to hold on through worse storms than this. "I can't. I don't know if choosing love over stability was right or wrong. I just know it was real. And maybe that's all we get." It wasn't reassurance, but it was truth. And truth was the only foundation worth building on, even if the structure it supported was smaller and harder than what came before. The Crown Assembly convened in the capital with all the theatrical pageantry of aristocracy, preparing to witness public execution disguised as legal procedure. 500 lords gathered in chambers designed to make individual voices feel insignificant, each one carrying opinions shaped by 3 weeks of strategic propaganda about the duke who'd lost his mind over a woman. Cassian entered flanked by Seraphina and 8 lords who'd chosen faith over certainty, walking through corridors lined with portraits of previous Blackthorns who'd ruled through calculated ruthlessness. His ancestors looked down with expressions suggesting they'd died disappointed in whoever came after. Maybe they had been right to expect failure from bloodlines too weak to sacrifice humanity for power. The assembly chamber felt colder than memory suggested. Stone walls amplified sound until every whisper became public declaration. Cassian took his position in the accused section while Lord Mordred's representatives occupied prosecution space with the confidence of people holding superior cards. The Lord Chancellor presiding over proceedings was a man named Westbrook, 70 years old and famous for valuing procedural correctness over every other consideration, including basic humanity. He reviewed documentation with mechanical precision before speaking. Duke Cassian Blackthorn stands accused of mental instability, rendering him unfit for ducal authority. Specific charges include erratic decision-making, violent assault on family member, and abandonment of strategic obligations for emotional reasoning. How does the accused respond? Cassian stood, feeling 500 pairs of eyes evaluate him for weakness. I respond that every charge is technically accurate and completely missing the point. Murmurs rippled through the chamber like waves hitting stone. I did cancel my wedding 4 hours before ceremony. I did physically attack my uncle. I did abandon strategic alliances for what you're calling emotional reasoning. He paused, letting the admission settle. But what the charges don't mention is that Lord Mordred Blackthorn spent 15 years systematically sabotaging my political campaigns, manufacturing crises, and manipulating me into decisions that served his control rather than Ravenspire's interests. What they don't mention is that the strategic marriage I abandoned was forced through coercion based on problems my uncle created specifically to leverage my compliance. Cassian gestured toward the evidence Marcus Threll had compiled. Every financial crisis that pushed me toward dependence on Lord Mordred's banking networks was orchestrated. Every political obstacle was manufactured. Every moment of pressure was calculated manipulation designed to ensure I remained controllable. Lord Mordred's lead prosecutor stood, a sharp-faced woman named Lady Ashford, who'd built her career on destroying reputations through procedural warfare. Even accepting your allegations as true, you responded to family manipulation by choosing personal relationship over territorial stability. You prioritized one woman's feelings over obligations to thousands who depend on Ravenspire's economic health. She moved toward the center of the chamber. That's not strength, Your Grace. That's selfishness disguised as romantic gesture. The accusation landed with devastating accuracy because it contained enough truth to cut through any defensive posturing. Cassian had chosen Seraphina over collective security, had valued personal authenticity over systematic stability, had destroyed an empire because keeping it required becoming someone he couldn't survive being. You're right, he said quietly. The chamber went silent. I did choose one person over collective obligation. I did prioritize personal relationship over economic stability. I did value love more than the empire I'd spent 5 years building. He looked around the assembly at lords who'd spent careers calculating cost versus benefit, treating people like strategic assets, building power through systematic suppression of anything resembling authentic emotion. And I'd make the same choice again. Not because it was strategically sound, not because it served the greater good, but because some things matter more than survival. He turned toward Seraphina, who sat in the witness section with composure that couldn't quite hide the tears threatening to break through. I spent 2 years watching the most brilliant person I've ever known make my empire function while I treated her like useful decoration. I let her believe her value was tied to strategic contribution. I let her think being necessary was the same as being chosen. His voice cracked slightly. When my uncle forced me to choose between her and political advantage, I picked power, because that's what I'd been trained to do. That's what every portrait in every Blackthorn corridor taught me was correct. Cassian looked back at the assembly. And it was the greatest mistake of my life. Not because it cost me political stability, but because it cost me the only relationship built on something besides calculated advantage. He moved to the center of the chamber. So yes, I'm guilty of prioritizing love over empire. Guilty of valuing one honest connection more than 1,000 strategic alliances. guilty of learning that the kind of power worth having doesn't come from dominating people, but from being worthy of standing beside them. Lady Ashford looked unimpressed. Beautiful speech, Your Grace, but words don't change the fact that thousands now suffer because you chose sentiment over responsibility. You're right again. Cassian felt the weight of that truth settle into his bones. My choice has consequences for people who never asked to be part of this decision. Staff losing positions, territories losing investment, families facing uncertainty because I valued personal authenticity over their collective security. He paused, but empires built on my uncle's manipulation would have collapsed eventually. The only question was whether that collapse happened honestly or whether I spent decades perpetuating lies that felt safer than truth. Lord Chancellor Westbrook raised his hand for silence. The Assembly will hear testimony regarding Lord Mordren's alleged manipulation. Marcus Threll, approach. The next 3 hours were systematic documentation of 15 years of calculated sabotage. Marcus presented correspondence, financial records, and testimony from sources inside Lord Mordren's network who'd finally decided conscience mattered more than compensation. Every piece of evidence supported Cassian's allegations, and every piece made his decision to fight back look more like justified resistance than mental instability. But Lady Ashford was relentless, turning even vindication into evidence of poor judgment. So you were manipulated by family member for 15 years and never noticed? That doesn't suggest mental fitness. That suggests you're dangerously naive or incompetent at reading people you should have understood. The attack was brilliant because it reframed Cassian's victimization as proof of inadequacy. Seraphina stood before anyone could stop her. I'd like to address the Assembly. Lord Chancellor Westbrook looked surprised but gestured permission. Lady Seraphina Vale, you may speak. Seraphina moved to the center with the controlled grace of someone walking into artillery fire, because retreat felt worse than wounds. Lady Ashford is right. Duke Blackthorn failed to recognize manipulation from someone he trusted. That's not strategic brilliance. That's human vulnerability. Her voice carried across stone walls with devastating honesty. But vulnerability isn't the same as weakness. I watched this man conquer territories through calculated ruthlessness. I helped him build political campaigns that crushed opposition through systematic intimidation. I was there for every moment he chose power over people. She looked directly at Cassian, and I watched him finally learn that real strength isn't domination. It's being willing to lose everything except the parts of yourself that make you worth standing beside. Seraphina turned back to the Assembly. You're evaluating his fitness based on whether he made strategically optimal choices. But optimal for what? For maintaining empire regardless of cost? For perpetuating systems built on manipulation? For becoming the kind of person who values control more than humanity? She moved closer to the assembled lords. Duke Blackthorn is guilty of choosing love over calculated advantage, guilty of valuing honesty more than strategic positioning, guilty of learning that some prices aren't worth paying regardless of what you gain. Her voice hardened. If that's mental instability, then maybe we need more unstable lords and fewer who treat people like pieces on game boards. The chamber erupted into arguments that took 10 minutes to silence. When order was restored, Lord Chancellor Westbrook looked exhausted. The Assembly will deliberate. Duke Blackthorn will await verdict. They filed out while Cassian stood in the accused section, surrounded by evidence that he'd been both victim and perpetrator, manipulated and manipulative, destroyed and destroyer. Seraphina appeared beside him as the chamber emptied. That was either brilliant or catastrophic, she said quietly. Probably both. They stood together in the space where aristocratic power decided who deserved authority and who deserved exile, knowing that whatever came next would define the rest of their lives. The verdict could strip Cassian of his title, could exile him from territories his family had ruled for 3 centuries, could reduce him to nothing except the man standing beside the woman who'd proven she could walk away. But walking into that chamber and speaking truth felt like the first authentic thing he'd done since inheriting power built on his ancestors' ruthlessness. Whatever happens, Cassian said, I'm glad we fought. Seraphina took his hand. Me too. The Assembly deliberated for 16 hours. Cassian and Seraphina waited in private chambers provided for the accused, neither sleeping, both reviewing possible futures that ranged from complete vindication to total destruction. Dawn came with Lord Chancellor Westbrook's summons. They returned to the Assembly chamber to find 500 lords already seated, their expressions revealing nothing except that whatever verdict had been reached would satisfy no one completely. Westbrook stood with documentation that would determine everything. The Assembly has reviewed all evidence regarding Duke Cassian Blackthorne's fitness for authority. We find that while Lord Mordred Blackthorne's manipulation was systematic and reprehensible, the Duke's response demonstrated concerning judgment in personal relationships interfering with territorial obligations. Cassian felt his stomach drop. However, Westbrook continued, "We also recognize that empires built on manipulation eventually collapse regardless of who rules them. The Duke's choice to expose and resist that manipulation, while personally costly, may have prevented longer-term catastrophic failure." The Chancellor paused. Therefore, the Assembly renders split verdict. Duke Cassian Blackthorne retains his title and authority over Ravenspire territories. However, he will operate under financial oversight for 3 years to ensure stability during reconstruction. Lord Mordred Blackthorne is formally exiled and stripped of all family privileges. Relief and disappointment warred in Cassian's chest. He'd survived, but survival came with conditions that acknowledged he'd failed as thoroughly as he'd succeeded. Additionally, Westbrook's voice hardened. The Assembly formally recognizes Lady Seraphina Vale's contributions to Ravenspire's political infrastructure and her role in exposing systematic corruption. She is granted noble title and seat on the Territorial Council. Seraphina's hand tightened in Cassian's. The verdict stands. This assembly is concluded. 500 lords filed out, leaving Cassian and Seraphina standing in chambers that had just determined they'd survived catastrophe through narrow margins and uncomfortable compromises. "We won," Seraphina said quietly. "We survived. There's a difference, is there?" Cassian looked at this woman who'd walked away when he'd proven himself unworthy and returned when he'd finally fought for something real. Yes, winning would mean we kept everything. Surviving means we lost most of it, but held on to what actually matters. They left the assembly chamber and walked through capital streets toward wherever came next, knowing that Ravenspire waited with damage that would take years to repair and consequences that would define generations. But they'd face it honestly, together, building something smaller and harder and infinitely more real than what came before. 1 year later, Ravenspire looked different, smaller. The secondary holdings had been sold to satisfy debt obligations. The grand capital estate was gone, replaced by fortress overlooking northern cliffs where ocean crashed endlessly against black stone. Harder. The aristocratic network Lord Mordred had controlled was permanently fractured. New alliances formed slowly, built on demonstrated reliability, rather than inherited obligation. Stronger. The people who remained had chosen to stay despite catastrophic uncertainty. Staff who valued honest employment over aristocratic pageantry. Lords who preferred smaller empire built on truth to larger one contaminated by manipulation. Cassian stood in the private breakfast chamber that had been rebuilt in the new fortress. Smaller than its predecessor, but positioned to catch morning light in ways that felt deliberately hopeful. The table was simpler, the chairs less ornate. Everything stripped down to essential function without unnecessary demonstration of wealth. At the center of the table sat a silver salt cellar, the same one from this night Seraphina had requested more salt, while 200 aristocrats waited for her public destruction. Cassian had ordered it preserved and placed here as permanent reminder of the moment she'd proven that walking away with dignity was more powerful than any theatrical breakdown. Seraphina entered carrying correspondence and the particular kind of exhaustion that came from rebuilding empires one careful decision at a time. She'd spent the year as his official strategic partner, no longer hidden advisor, but recognized authority whose title and council seat acknowledged what she'd always been. "Morning," she said, kissing him before sitting across the table. "Morning." They'd married 3 months after the assembly verdict. Small ceremony with 30 witnesses who mattered more than 300 who attended for political positioning. No grand cathedral, no orchestrated spectacle, just 2 people who'd learned that love required daily choice rather than one dramatic gesture. The reconstruction was proceeding slowly. Financial oversight meant every decision faced scrutiny from council that didn't trust Cassian's judgment completely, but couldn't deny his commitment to honest governance. Some days felt like punishment for choosing love over calculated advantage. Other days felt like the first authentic thing he'd built in years. "How bad?" Cassian asked, gesturing at the correspondence. 3 more contract disputes. 2 territorial disagreements that need arbitration. 1 minor house testing whether we're weak enough to push around. Serafina poured coffee with mechanical efficiency. Standard morning catastrophe. Nothing we can't handle. She said it with the weary certainty of someone who'd learned that handling catastrophe was just what they did now. Not through dominance, but through persistent competence applied to problems that never fully resolved. Cassian reached across the table and took her hand. Do you regret it? Which part? All of it. The fight, the collapse. Choosing this instead of whatever life you could have built independently. Serafina looked at him with eyes that had witnessed his worst failures and chosen to stay anyway. Every single day, she said quietly. His heart stopped. Then she smiled. Every single day, I'm glad we fought. Glad we chose honesty. Glad we built something real, even if it's smaller than what came before. She squeezed his hand. I regret the people who suffered because we prioritized our relationship. I regret the staff who lost positions. I regret the families facing uncertainty because you valued me more than their collective security. Her voice was steady but carried weight of responsibility neither could escape. But I don't regret us. I don't regret learning that being chosen matters more than being useful. I don't regret discovering that love is the hardest thing I've ever fought for and the only battle that feels worth winning. Cassian felt tears threatening and refused to be embarrassed by emotional vulnerability that would have horrified the man he'd been 2 years prior. That man had ruled through calculated dominance, treating people like strategic assets, building power through systematic suppression of authentic connection. That man had been successful and lonely and slowly dying inside expensive isolation. This man ruled smaller territory with harder conditions and persistent acknowledgement of how thoroughly he'd failed at protecting everyone who'd depended on him. But this man woke up beside someone who knew his worst failures and loved him anyway, who challenged him daily, who made rebuilding feel like collaboration rather than lonely burden. That trade felt worth every catastrophic consequence. I love you, he said. I know. Serafina stood and moved around the table to kiss him properly. Now finish your coffee. We have territorial council at 9 and I need you coherent. She left to prepare for the meeting that would decide whether Ravenspire could afford infrastructure repairs or had to delay another season. Cassian sat alone in the breakfast chamber staring at the salt cellar that represented the night everything changed. Power had always been architecture to him. You built environments where other people's choices narrowed to the ones you permitted. You controlled through systematic elimination of alternatives. You conquered by making resistance feel pointless. But real power, the kind worth having, came from being worthy of standing beside people who could walk away anytime but chose to stay. That required daily recommitment, daily acknowledgement of failure, daily choice to keep fighting for something that mattered more than comfortable dominance. Cassian had spent his entire life building empires through calculated ruthlessness. This smaller, harder, infinitely more honest version was the first thing he'd created that felt worth preserving. Not because it was larger or more impressive than what came before, but because it was real. And reality, he'd finally learned, was the only foundation capable of supporting weight that actually mattered. He picked up the salt cellar, feeling cold silver against his palm. Then he set it back at the center of the table where it belonged. A permanent reminder. The night she'd refused to break for a man too afraid to fight for her. The morning he'd finally become dangerous enough to fight properly. The year they'd spent learning that love wasn't romantic gesture, but grinding daily choice to keep choosing each other even when easier options existed. Cassian stood and moved to the window overlooking cliffs where ocean met stone in endless violent repetition. The view was smaller than what he'd commanded from the Grand Capital estate. The territory was diminished. The power was constrained. But watching dawn break over water that had crashed against these cliffs for centuries before blackthorns existed and would continue long after they were forgotten, Cassian felt something he'd never experienced while ruling through dominance. Peace. Not the peace of unchallenged authority. The peace of knowing that whatever came next, he'd face it honestly beside someone who'd proven she could survive without him but chose to stay anyway. That choice was the greatest victory of his life. Not conquest. Not domination. Not power accumulated through systematic destruction of everyone who resisted. Just 2 people who'd learned that the hardest battle worth fighting was the one against your own cowardice. And they'd won. Not completely, not without catastrophic cost. Not in ways that would be celebrated by lords who valued empire over humanity. But they'd won the only war that actually mattered. The war against becoming the kind of person who sacrificed real connection for comfortable isolation. Serafina appeared in the doorway. Council starts in 10 minutes. Are you ready? Cassian turned from the window, leaving behind the view of endless ocean that put human ambition into perspective that felt both humbling and strangely liberating. He crossed the room and took her hand. Every day, he said, because that was the truth they'd learned through fire and collapse and systematic destruction of everything that looked like success. Love wasn't one dramatic choice. It was 1,000 daily decisions to keep choosing each other even when the cost felt catastrophic. They walked toward the council chamber together, two people who'd survived their own worst decisions and each other's greatest failures, ready to face whatever new catastrophe awaited in the endless work of building something real. The empire was smaller, the power was constrained, the future was uncertain. But they had each other, and that was enough. Not because it solved every problem or erased every consequence, but because some things mattered more than empire, and they'd finally learned which things those were. The salt cellar remained on the breakfast table, waiting for tomorrow's dawn. A permanent reminder that the greatest strength wasn't domination. It was being brave enough to kneel before the only throne that mattered, and earning the right to stand beside someone who chose you every single day. This story is entirely fictional, created solely for entertainment and cinematic storytelling purposes.